Thank you, Julia and Malcolm. Travel and tourism is one of those industries that has been implicated deeply in biodiversity loss. But what is different about travel and tourism from many other industries is that it has options, not only in the way that it conducts business, but in the way that it can influence tangential businesses that it operates with, and with the broad consumer audience, which are basically its customers. So to help us explore how it impacts travel and tourism in its different sectors, we have representatives from private business, from destination, and from organizations that are trying to move the needle within travel and tourism. So please welcome to the stage Helen Usher, co-founder and director of Ana Mondial. WTTC Vice Chair, as well as Executive Chairman and co-founder of Intrepid Group, Daryl Wade. And welcome back, the CEO and President of NYC & Company, Fred Dixon. Thank you all for joining. And Helen, I'm going to start and end with you to help us frame this discussion. So Ana Mondial audits and consults with travel and tourism businesses to help them move towards more positive impacts. And with WTTC, you produced a report, which I believe is being released today. It's called Towards Nature Positive Travel and Tourism. And it recommends that travel and tourism businesses adopt a nature-positive approach. So within the context of the travel industry, how would you define that?
I think it's really helpful to see it as a double-sided approach. So I would say it's first about assessing and defining your impacts on animals and nature so that you can be aware of your touch points with it, so you know where you've got to take the action. And then it's minimizing on those key areas. Then it's looking at actually proactively restoring the protection of nature and restoring biodiversity so that we can, in effect, then reach those climate goals and achieve net zero.
Well, and in terms of particularly the climate goals, because there's two things, they're all interrelated, of course, but the biodiversity protection on one hand, but with the climate change, the industry has been in some ways the villain. Airlines, hotels in aggregate. So generally speaking, I know that you consult individual business to business, but if there were some more general things that you could say are going to really move the needle, what changes would you like to see in the industry?
Well, I think we are privileged to be in an industry where we really can actually deliver change on those local levels. So I think it's about positive collaboration, working with others to make sure that we achieve the same global goals. And ultimately, this is our shared planet, so it's really time that we take action on this new initiative together. I think what we can do is not just focus on our impacts in destinations, so don't just always think about only the products that we're selling, the experiences that we're selling, but think about the whole supply chain, the whole value chain. Consider the partners that you work with. If you partner with airlines or you partner with DMCs in destinations, it's actually making sure that everyone's aligned with the similar sort of policies. And I think also it's about working with others outside of the industry, so working with NGOs as well on the ground. Remember that actually consider them as partners and part of the supply chain rather than just, people that are asking for money. They're delivering, they're delivering the changes on the ground. So I think it's important to respect them.
We'll get back to the supply chain in a minute, but Daryl, the report identifies 5 drivers of biodiversity loss: land and sea use, overexploitation of natural resources, climate change, pollution, and invasive species. So you are essentially a tour operator, for those who don't know. So what do you consider to be the main challenges in your area, and how can travel and tourism mitigate it?
Yeah, Arnie, when you ask it like that, and the 5 factors, and the factors that, to be honest, you don't necessarily know a lot about in terms of the detail, it's really daunting. And I think For CEOs, all the time, you're confronted with issues that you don't necessarily know a lot about. And as a CEO for a long time, slightly ashamed to admit, I didn't know much about finance. I didn't know about accounting. I didn't understand it. But as a CEO, you get people around you who do know something about it. And as a CEO, it's no excuse. You can't go to the auditors at the end of the year and say, oh, sorry, I don't do finance, or the tax department, oh, I don't understand tax. You get people around you and you muster resources so that you do know things about it and you establish plans and so forth. And so with things like climate change or biodiversity, it's exactly the same. You've just got to go through things methodically with your team and create a plan and go to work and make it happen. So it's like anything else, it's just not that hard when you actually have the commitment. So to your question though, what is the biggest challenge in making it happen? I actually suspect it's leadership. I'll be the first to admit that biodiversity until this report came out was not on my radar like it should have been. And when I read the draft of it, I thought, we've actually really got a role to play here and we can do something. And so then you take it to your management team, you drop it down into the specialists in the organisation that can do something and create plans. And so to answer your question, I think it's leadership about what needs to happen.
So, Fred, nature positive, your destination that you promote is a city. So does nature positive have an important role to play in an urban jungle as well as a rainforest?
Yeah, it's true, right? Urban jungle is what you think about when you think about cities like New York. But the reality is, though, we have 7,000 species of animals that live throughout the 5 boroughs. 180 of those are actually considered rare. So, the environment that we live in, obviously cities by their very definition are more sustainable as destinations because of the density, the mass transit. But we also are outside a tremendous amount. And we're fortunate in New York by design and partially by luck to have 500 miles of shoreline in our city. Surfing the Rockaways is now a badge of honor for travelers from Australia and around the world. So we have to care for these. Central Park is not the most visited park in the United States in terms of public parks, not national parks, for no reason, right? People need to connect with nature. And so we've had a commitment for a long time at NYC & Company promoting the green assets of our city. But these issues, and you're right, I mean, the layer of biodiversity actually, I think, got lost on many of us. But there was lots of organizations within the city of New York, the Wildlife Conservation Society is one, that do a tremendous amount of work around the globe, not only focusing on diversity of plants, but also animals. And so as part of a destination sell in New York, particularly today with the trend towards wellness, trends toward experiential, people want to come for Broadway, they want to come for shopping, but they also want a quality experience. They want to be surrounded by fresh waters. They want to be able to have access to green parks. And so all of these elements play a role in travel and tourism, the attractiveness of a destination. I was just in Chicago recently, and I hadn't been in many years, and I was so delighted by how clean the river was. And I went on a tour, an architecture tour. If you all haven't done it, it's a fun thing to do. Not that I'm promoting Chicago, but, but the river was so clean, and it just added to the experience, right? So not only is it quality of life for the residents, it's quality of life for the visitors, and these things are all interconnected, and we all share in that responsibility.
So there's the biodiversity side, and then there's also climate change, which is kind of a broader thing. New York and cities like it, there are so many competing interests, and as important as travel and tourism is, it often is regarded as a bit more trivial, a little over to the side. It's about fun and Broadway and all these things, even though it's economic drive, as an economic driver, it's critical. So what sort of role do you see in the city that NYC & Company can play in terms of climate change?
Yeah, it's interesting, as a destination marketing organization or as a tourism board, you sit at an intersection of a number of important audiences, right? So the individual travelers themselves, the public, the trade, our partners who are driving travel around the world and putting in place their own policies and procedures and practices. And then our local businesses as well, and all the supply chain that they connect. So we actually sit at an interesting nexus of communication, of prioritization, of dialogue. And so for us, it is about setting that agenda, showing people how to explore the city in a responsible way. We host significant events in New York, right? So the UN General Assembly is going on right now. We were honored to host World Pride in 2019. One of our commitment, 5 million people came from around the world for World Pride. It was the largest Pride event ever on the planet. But we knew that was could have an impact on the local ecosystem, on the local climate. And so we worked really hard with our partners in industry to message reduction of your carbon footprint while you're in New York. So these are things that may perhaps small alone, but in aggregate, they actually have quite an amazing impact. So whether it's promoting best practices, and interestingly, some of the leaders in the climate change space, certainly in terms of retrofitting buildings, improving energy efficiency, have come from the travel and tourism sector. The Empire State Building was one of the first in New York City. They were way ahead of the curve, and compliments to Tony Malkin for his leadership in retrofitting that building, which was built in the 1920s, and it is now one of the most efficient buildings in the city. So they set the standard. The Met Museum did the same thing. This facility, obviously you heard me speak earlier about what they have done. So travel and tourism, I think, has a very important role to play in setting those priorities and leading that dialogue.
Okay. So supply chain has come up now a couple of times. And Daryl, I know Intrepid Group is a B corporation, B for beneficial. Mm-hmm. And it's, I think, the largest B corporation in travel, or at least it was when you got the certification.
I think it still might be.
So when supply chain and maybe biodiversity is an area that's new, but I would imagine that in that process of getting certified and that process of just you being Daryl Wade, and I understand your ethics on all these things, you must have looked at supply chain issues. When you did, how did you approach your vendors? What did you discover about what their practice is? And then how did you try to influence that?
Yeah, and so it's good that supply chain is coming up, here, because it is really critical. And, just on climate change, as a tour operator, 80% of our emissions are scope 3 emissions, which effectively are within the supply chain. Right. And when we start looking at biodiversity properly, I'm sure we'll find a similar thing. So I think most businesses, but for Intrepid as a tour operator, our relationship with the supply chain, is a critical one. And, it's a multi-layered approach. And so if you think about it, well, a supplier by definition supplies some product or service to us as a company, but ultimately to our travellers. And so you've got a relationship there at a contractual level, which is, pricing and quality service provision. But if you look a little bit deeper that, as a tour operator, we also put in other factors to that relationship. So for instance, there's health and safety issues that are very critical. We do a lot of our operations in developing countries where health and safety issues are not as good as say, here in the States or in Australia. And so we contract and indeed audit health and safety arrangements as a part of our relationship process. So that goes deep through tens of thousands of suppliers across the world. We've recently started doing the same thing with climate change, where we start to say, well, if 80% of our emissions are in this supply chain, we've actually got to be working with our suppliers about getting them to convert to renewable energy or change vehicles in time. And you start to set a program up with suppliers to adjust their sourcing mechanisms. And it will be exactly the same with biodiversity when we start to layer that through. So it's all possible. And I think one of the interesting things is, and perhaps it's particularly where we operate around the world, but a lot of the suppliers are relatively or very small businesses. And sometimes, when we raise these issues, they don't know what to do, and so they don't have any expertise. But we actually, as a larger company, do have domain expertise. And so we can say, hey, don't worry about it, it's fine. Here's what we'll do. And we can supply some documentation or some training or whatever it takes. And so in fact, it's a way to enhance the trusted relationship you have with your supply chain. So rather than being seen as something that's onerous and pushed down, it's seen as something that's beneficial and really welcoming, because we're making them better people and better businesses. And ultimately, that's what we all want to do and be, isn't it?
Yeah. And so it sounds like you have a big bushel of carrots. Do you ever have the stick? Do you ever say, if you don't meet this target, though, we're going to have to discontinue doing business with you?
Yeah, look, sometimes. It usually doesn't get to that, though. And if you come in and say, look, we want this done by next week, It's unreasonable. And so, you know, whilst there is an urgency to the climate conversation, we all understand that urgency, you've still got to be reasonable and practical. And so you've got to say, you know, this is what we're wanting to see in 3 years' time, or whatever it is. It might be that they can deliver it in 1 month's time, but give them time, work through. When you're next meeting with them, remind them of that commitment and so forth. And if they say, you know, at the 11th hour, look, we just can't do that, then yes, you might be changing supplier. But you take your time and you have it as a conversation, and we never change through an issue like this. It just doesn't happen.
So Fred, you don't have the same sorts of suppliers, but you have members who likewise you can impact. Each of them has probably at this point a corporate social responsibility program. But these end up, from my observation, being sort of a patchwork of disjointed efforts. Everybody focuses maybe on something a little bit different in their CSR programs. So can a destination organization such as yours, which is a membership organization, connect the dots to try to ensure that tourism-related businesses as a whole can effectively support nature and climate goals?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, you and I both sit on the Tourism Cares Board. I think that's one great example of an organization that runs across the industry and has done a terrific job of setting the narrative. Yeah, absolutely. I think you know, everyone has their own programs, which is terrific. But as a DMO, I think we do have the responsibility for setting a narrative. And so bringing everyone together under one sort of strategy is important. And that's why programs like this, other educational programs we operate throughout the year, where we bring people together. Our new sustainability committee of our board, which Alan, the CEO here at Javits, chairs, has, you know, coalesced those energies and those actions under sort of one direction. And so we are actually going to be taking biodiversity back as one of the new focuses of some of those dialogues, making sure that we're being a positive catalyst for those pieces. So this has been an important takeaway for us today. But I think there is absolutely a role that we can play, and we'll continue to work towards that.
Okay. Helen, it's been mentioned COP15 is coming up in December in Montreal. And its purpose at this point looks more to be almost just to encourage the global commitments and actions from the nations that are participating. The WTTC Biodiversity Report appears to indicate travel and tourism is a critical industry in the movement to halt this. Why is it that you can conclude that travel and tourism can play such a significant role at this time?
It always has had that role to play, always. I think right now we've actually got the eyes and ears open. So as you've just mentioned, for some reason, biodiversity hasn't really been connected to climate change. It doesn't really make sense. But now we've got this actually on the agenda. So I think we've got the opportunity together to galvanise and come together and lead this and take this to COP and actually put forward our vision, which is to make travel and tourism guardians of nature, which is the next step that we're hoping to take on the back of this report. We recognise that it's all about actually changing policy. And ultimately, that's where we want to go to. So I think if we can all come together, a WTTC and a Montreal, and you know, members of the travel and tourism sector, even the private sector, NGOs as well, we can really leverage that change.
And Arnie, ultimately, it's self-interest for the tourism industry.
Of course.
You know, if we get, as Julia was saying before, you know, so much of tourism is related to natural environment. And so we've actually got a vested self-interest to get this right, because it will be good for our industry in the long term, quite apart from any biodiversity benefits.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's true. And I would just add, I mean, there also are resiliency components to this as well. I mean, one of the coolest projects that's been underway here in New York for a number of years, focusing on biodiversity, is restoring the oyster beds in our harbor. So, you know, what started out, it's so cool, and it has become a real driver of interest. You actually can go down and tour it. It's a great program for students and visitors that are interested in this topic. But what started out as a sort of a modest project is now a 1 billion oyster project, restoring oysters to our shores, to the waterways rather, creating more coastal resilience for us, because we know that storms are going to continue to increase. So the role that visitors can play in supporting these kinds of projects actually meet multiple goals.
I think that leads on to another point, is that we actually
We're going to be talking a long time here.
I know, I'm looking at
That's
the
good.
clock.
Don't forget the clock. Keep going.
Yeah.
We have the opportunity to actually immerse people in these experiences, in these great, exciting new initiatives that we can learn about. And I think immersion is actually proven to be one of the leading ways that you can change mindsets. So travel and tourism has the opportunity to do that with people young and old. So we can really take this message down to those at the individual level. We can, work with visitors, the public, our employees, and encourage them to be part of the change as well. But we do need to make sure there are solutions available for the sector to deliver on this. And I think with my experience and my colleagues' experience at UN Mondial of working with the travel and tourism sector, it's just so disjointed. There's not been sort of a single framework or set of guidelines to focus on to deliver upon this. But we do have actually a tool that's being launched around about now called Animal Footprint, which will actually enable the travel and tourism sector to put all of this into action. And that's also sort of supporting basically the framework of the report as well. So I think really now it's about looking to release some funds to help travel and tourism do this. It's some policies to make sure it becomes a real priority, and then allowing that sort of expertise and resource to be focused on within our travel businesses so that our colleagues can actually deliver, and it's not just another massive worry for them or concern. It's something that's integrated within their job.
You mentioned that we're doing this in part for our employees and things. It's also appears that in addition to regulators and investors and consumers who are pushing companies to do the right things, very often the management and staff are pushing companies to do the right thing and want to work for a company that they feel is part of the solution. Daryl, I'm just going back to you, and again, I know that part of the B Corporation certification includes a lot of employee related things. And I know you've made great efforts. Do you think these efforts satisfy your stakeholders, which include your employees, or is there pressure to do more?
There's two answers here. One answer is yes. We take a multi-stakeholder view to our strategy, and so by that we define our stakeholders as our customers, our staff, the environment and communities we serve, and lastly our shareholders. And we say lastly our shareholders because our view is that if we get all the others right, then our shareholders will do okay. So they'll almost take care of themselves. And so we set defined metrics that we want. So for our customers, it's just an NPS score that we want to see heading north. And our staff, it's a staff engagement score, which we want to see heading north. And for environment and communities, it's related to B Corp, and they give us various methodologies to monitor our performance, and we want that heading north. So over the last 10 years, all of those metrics for us have headed in the right direction. So the quick answer is yes. And by the way, our return on investment for shareholders has been way north of anything Wall Street had provided, so we've done okay too. So that's great. Where I perhaps would say no, though, is that I think sometimes those stakeholders don't talk enough. The inference in your question was that they put too many demands on CEOs and boards and management. I would argue actually that they don't do enough. And so sometimes you're doing actions almost in a vacuum. And sometimes it's nice for the customers to say, hey, have you thought about this? Or third-party not-for-profit saying, look at biodiversity. Oh yeah, okay. And so I think actually the stimulation of ideas needs to be more, not less.
Helen, I'm going to give you the last word. Is there a primary challenge that you've run into when you talk to people in the travel industry that you find the most resistance to?
I think it's just been the fact that this has not been interconnected before. People just haven't known where to go. They can understand that animal and nature protection is important in terms of perhaps not having detrimental impacts on animals and destinations or seeing horrible sights that you don't want to view, but never have we actually had this piece of going, actually, fundamentally, we need to integrate the two. And so it's about delivering some way that the travel and tourism sector can do that. It's about interconnecting the net zero piece and carbon and the metric behind that, with biodiversity protection, which I think and I hope is happening behind the scenes at the moment. So I think once that's delivered and we've got those metrics, we can all work off the same hymn sheet.
Okay, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Fred Dixon, Daryl Wade, Helen Usher.